Hi everyone, Kelly here, and since it is March, there is a readathon going on that I really love during March, and that is Middle Grade March, where it is just a readathon where you read middle grade. So even if you're reading one middle grade novel, you're participating. And because I really love this readathon, I'll put the information about the host and everything down below, because it's still March, you can still participate. That since I love this readathon and I love middle grade, I wanted to share with you some of my favorite middle grade fantasy novels. And for me, I like some contemporary middle grades. Maybe I'll do a separate video on my favorite contemporaries, but the middle grade I really love is middle grade fantasy. I think because when it comes to fantasy, if you're writing for children, you can be a little more nonsensical and a little more just like fun and daring than maybe an adult fantasy novel would be. And also there's a little less of the violence and war stuff that would happen in adult fantasy, which is not my favorite part. I just like more like whimsical and fun and like adventure stories. And so that's why I love middle grade fantasy. So if you are somebody that enjoys that, like wants more like adventure stories happening, but maybe don't want the level of violence and things that are in adult fantasy, here are some middle grade novels that I as an adult really love. Or if you have children that are of the age to read middle grade, these would be ones you might want to pick up for them. And so the way I wanted to do this is I'm going to start off with individual books I really love, and then towards the end, I'm going to talk about my favorite authors that I've read several of their middle grade fantasy and recommend them just as an author. And so first, I'm going to talk about one of my new favorite middle grade series, which if you've been around here and watched my videos, you probably know what it is, and that is Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. I'm on book 5 of this series, and I just love it. It's kind of has that epic fantasy feel where there's this big world that you're getting introduced to and lots of people. And so each book, you're getting more characters, you're getting more absorbed into this world, and it's just a lot of fun. They are big books, but I find them easy to read since they are for children, but then also they just encompass so much of this world because it's such a big book. This is about a young girl named Sophie. I believe she's 12 at the beginning of the series, and she thinks she's a normal human, but that she can hear people's thoughts. Like she is telepathic and just hears everybody's thoughts. So it makes her life really hard and in school and everything because she's just getting bombarded by people's thoughts. But then one day she meets a boy that tells her that she's not actually human. There's a reason why she can hear everybody's thoughts. And so she gets swept into this new world and introduced to all these different abilities and people and stuff, and it is so much fun. I'm really loving this series and all the characters in it, so I would highly recommend this if you're somebody that liked Harry Potter. Not saying that this is like Harry Potter, but that if you just like having like a whole new world to jump into with lots and lots of characters and kind of like things that might have happened at the beginning coming back books later and stuff like that, this is the series for you. I've obviously not read the entire series. I think there's 9 books at this point, and I've only read the first 4. I'm starting the 5th book now, but so far, the first 4, I have loved every single book. And then next is a book I just finished, and some of these fantasy books also have other genres as well, and this one is fantasy historical fiction, and that is Sweep, the Story of a Girl and Her Monster by Jonathan Auxier. And this is historical fiction in the fact that it takes place in Victorian London and is following a young girl who is a chimney sweep. And so we learn all that historical facts that are true about how horrible it was for these young children who were chimney sweeps and risked their lives climbing through chimneys and flues and all that. And so you get all of that backstory about the hardship of their lives, but then there's also fantasy in the fact that she becomes friends with this golem who starts off as like a little ball of soot, sorry, I can't pronounce that correctly, and then turns into this friend of hers that is her protector and is her golem. And I just think it is a really sweet story. This is really hyped. I've heard a ton of people on BookTube talk about it as like one of their favorite middle grade, and I don't want to overhype it. I just think it's a good story and a tale about friendship, but then also introduces you to a whole world of hardships that used to happen to children. And then next is a classic, so everybody's probably heard of it, but you might not realize how fun it is to read it, even as an adult, and that is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. I read this for the first time as an adult 2 years ago, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I cannot wait till my kids get old enough that we can read this together as like a nightly chapter book. it was so much fun to read this, especially if you have young children. I think that this is like the perfect book to read as an adult with young kids, because you can see your children in this book. So much of this story, I didn't realize, is basically just like the ramblings of a toddler. Like if you have a toddler and you know that they make up these stories, and when you watch them play and they're like creating little worlds for themselves, that's totally what this story is. And I loved it. I actually like Through the Looking Glass even better than the first book. And I just really think it's continually worth reading, even though it is a classic. And everybody thinks they know it's about, if you've seen the movie and stuff like that, but I would highly recommend reading the books. They're fast reads and they're a lot of fun. Another one that I've read recently and really loved is The One and Only Ivan by Catherine Applegate. And I don't know if this technically counts as fantasy, but I'm putting it in because even though it's based on a true story, we're following in the mind of a gorilla, and all of his friends are animals, but they talk to each other and stuff like that. So I view that as kind of like fantasy, but it also could be considered, I don't know, contemporary with some fantastical elements. But anyways, we're following this gorilla named Ivan, and we're hearing it from his point of view. So people might find it weird to read because it is written like a gorilla, which I know sounds silly, but it has kind of like short, choppy sentences and things like that because we're in Ivan's head. But Ivan is living at a mall in like a zoo enclosure, and he has other friends, like an elephant that he's friends with a big elephant that came from the zoo, and then another little elephant named Ruby comes. He's got a stray dog named Bob that is one of his best friends, and they're just living in this mall in captivity. And it's a story about his daily life, but then also about the hope for a better life. And I just think that this was such a heartwarming story. There was times I laughed out loud and thought it was really funny, but then it's also like sweet and sad and touching as well. So I would highly recommend this. It's a fast read. I think I read it in one day. Really good. It's going to be a movie coming out this August, so if you want to read it before the movie comes out. And there's also a sequel coming out that I think follows Bob, his dog friend, and that will be coming out soon as well. And then next, I have a series that I've only read the first book of, but I really enjoyed it, and that is The Forbidden Library by Django Wexler. And I think this is a 4 or 5 book series, and it is about a young girl whose father disappears, and so she is sent to live with an uncle who I'm not sure if he's actually her uncle, but an uncle figure. And he lives in this giant mansion like by himself and has a library out back, and he has told her that she can go anywhere in the mansion, but she's forbidden to go in the library. And of course, like any young curious girl, she decides to go check out the library and finds a whole world inside this library and discovers there are people who can read themselves into stories, read things out of the stories. And I just really enjoyed the fantastical elements of this, and it being centered around books and a library. There's also a talking cat, which I think is on the cover, that becomes her friend, and that's a trope I love, the like talking cat friend. And then I also thought that this one was great because sometimes middle grade fantasy has a lot of conveniences, and so you're reading it and you're like, I know exactly what's gonna happen. They're gonna be saved at the last minute by this thing. And I felt like this one had higher stakes. Like even though you're gonna know, since it's a longer series, things are going to progress and they're gonna get out of certain situations. I felt like that anxiety when they were in the situation more than I do in some more simplistic fantasy stories. So this is one I think adults could enjoy as well as kids in terms of like the suspense involved in these like life or death situations in middle grade fantasy. And then I want to talk about a book I don't own, so I'll show the picture, and that is Just Ella by Margaret Peterson Haddix. And this is the start of a trilogy, but all 3 of the books are companion books, so they don't necessarily need to be read the whole series. And I would actually only suggest the first book. I didn't really like the second and third book as well. I mean, if you're a completionist and want to read the whole series, that's fine, but I would definitely recommend Just Ella. And what this is a basically continuation of Cinderella. So Ella is Cinderella, and this takes place after the end of the fairy tale, and she finds herself about to become a princess, about to get married to this man, and then she realizes, I don't know anything about this guy. Like, he's got me out of a bad situation, but do I really want to marry him? Do I really want to become a princess? I barely know him. And it's just kind of that crisis of like realizing that you've gotten yourself in a situation that determines the rest of your life. And I just really like that because Cinderella is not one of my favorite stories because it is just seems like, you know, she's relying on this man to get her out of her situation, and it doesn't really give a lot of power to Cinderella. And I feel like this book gives Cinderella that power of like making decisions about her future. And so I would highly recommend it if you are somebody that kind of like always thought Cinderella was a weak character. I think this is a great continuation of the fairy tale, and I would at least suggest the first book in the trilogy. And you don't have to continue. It ends in a satisfying enough way that you wouldn't have to like continue the series. I think actually when she was writing it, she didn't continue for several years, so it was written as a standalone. So you can read it like that. And if we're talking about retellings of fairy tales and stuff like that, I would recommend East by Edith Pitot. This is a retelling of a folk story called, I think it's, what is it, East of the Sun, West of the Moon. Don't quote me on that because I've never actually read the original folk story, but this is very much kind of like a Beauty and the Beast tale. It is about our main character is Rose, who is trying to save her sister who is really sick, and this polar bear shows up and says if Rose goes with her and agrees to be his captive, that he will make sure that her sister is healed. And so kind of like Beauty and the Beast, she's sacrificing herself to save her family and agrees to be a captive of this bear. And it does kind of follow a little bit like Beauty and the Beast, and we get to know her and her talents. She's really good at, is it weaving or sewing? It's been a little bit since I've read this. And then we also see the polar bear and his backstory and all that stuff. And I thought this was a really sweet story. I liked it. I thought the ending was a bit rushed, but I did enjoy it in total. And I'm not going to continue because this is a duology. There's a second story, but this one can be read by itself. It ends like you wouldn't know that there had to be a second book. So I would at least suggest this first book. And now let's move on to authors that I really enjoyed that write a lot of middle grade. Some of these authors also write adult books or young adult, but their middle grade is the ones I've read and really enjoyed. And the first one is Tamara Pierce, and she has written several series, and some of them are middle grade, some are YA, and a lot of them take place in the Tortall universe, which is a world that's kind of, I don't know, what is it, medieval when you're talking about knights and things like that. So that's what her world is like. And the first one that I read was the Song of the Lioness series, which is about Alana. And this first book, Alana, the First Adventure, is middle grade, and then the rest of that quartet moves into YA territory because there's some stuff that might not be appropriate for all middle schoolers. So if you're recommending this for kids, just be aware that maybe you would only want them to read the first book at this time. But if you're an adult, I would definitely recommend reading the entire series. I loved it. I love Alana. She's a very like strong, brave character. She's a girl who, you know, is destined to go kind of like finishing school and become a wife and all that, but she wants to become a knight, and women are not allowed to be knights. And so she takes her twin brother's place as being in school to be a knight, whatever that would be, and, you know, trains to become a knight. And we follow her like whole teenage life into her early 20s in this quartet and the like adventures she has. And I just love it. I liked it as the series went on. I loved it more. I loved her viewpoints of marriage and what she wanted to do with her life. I thought it was really great. And then if you read that and you enjoy it, then you can move on to the quartet called the Immortals. And I've only read the first book in this series, but I loved it even more than I loved Alana. This one is definitely middle grade. I don't know if the whole series is middle grade, but this first one felt like middle grade. But of course, if your kids are reading this one, you want to read this series before this series, so maybe you want to wait till they're a little older so they can read the entire Alana series before moving on to this. But this takes place from a girl named Dane who starts out as 13 years old, and she can speak to animals, has a special connection with them. And so she's traveling with this woman who is herding ponies to go to the capital city or whatever, and she is along for the ride to help with the ponies, but then encounters all these different people, a lot of people that come from this series, so that's why you want to read that series first. And I just thought this was really well paced. There was a lot of exciting stuff happening. I love Dane as a character, and it was just a lot of fun, this series. Next, I want to talk about an author that I'm sure all of you have heard of, and that is Roald Dahl. And some of his books get a little crazy and wouldn't be appropriate for children. All of these I have rated on Goodreads, and you want to look and see kind of like whether I think they're appropriate for kids, but as adults, I still think they were a lot of fun. I haven't reread all of his books, but at least these three and the BFG were my favorites, and I loved listening to them. Obviously, Charlie and Chocolate Factory, probably most people know what that's about. I loved the audiobook for that, and I thought it was a lot of fun. The only thing that I would think with children is to watch The Age of Kids based on, like, there's a lot of, kids being very bad in this. I'm sure you know from if you've watched the movies, and so you might not want really young children watching it because Willy Wonka does some things to the bad children. So it might not be appropriate for very young, but for middle schoolers, I think it'd be fun. And then Matilda is such a fun audiobook. It's narrated by Kate Winslet, and I really loved it. Matilda is a lover of books, so I think as somebody that loves books, I loved reading about her. For children, I would just be a little aware because the teacher, not her nice teacher, but the principal in this is abusive to children, like flat out abusive to children. So I wouldn't read this to like my 5-year-old because I think that she wouldn't understand that it's supposed to be like funny and satirical. So you would want to wait until a child is old enough to realize that like that principal is really bad and shouldn't be abusing the children. And then I loved James and the Giant Peach. This is a really short one, but this was such a fun read. There are in the audiobook a few curse words, so I wouldn't necessarily have young kids listen to it, but you could read it to a young kid and just leave out the curse words. And then the BFG, my 5-year-old did listen to that, and it was, I think, perfectly appropriate for young children and was a lot of fun to listen to. It's probably my favorite Roald Dahl book at this point. I still need to listen to a few more of his, but I think I'm now getting into the ones that are really wild and not appropriate for children anymore. Next, I want to talk about two of my favorite middle grade authors, and they write the same kind of stories, which is something I love, which is kind of like fairy tale-like fantasy books. So they're not necessarily based on actual fairy tales. Some of them are, but then some of them just feel like a fairy tale, you know what I mean, if you know what I mean. So I just really enjoy them, kind of like with princesses and dragons and things like that in them. And they are two of my favorite authors. And the first one is Gail, Carson, Levine. Almost every book I have read by her has been a 4 or 5 stars, except for one of them, which is Ever. I did not like that book, but all the other ones I really have loved. She writes some that are more for older, so I would say that Two Princesses of Bamar is one of my favorite, but it would be not for like really young kids, but for the middle grade age. And this one is about two princesses. One of them is a brave and adventurous princess, Princess Meryl, and then Princess Addie is more shy and cautious, and a disease comes to their kingdom and they need to find a cure, but the adventurous sister is the one that gets sick, and so our shy Princess Addie is the one that has to try to save her kingdom. And so she has to set off and learn to be brave and courageous because she needs to save her sister. And I love this one so much. It was such a good story. And then if you have a slightly younger reader, The Tale of Two Castles was a really good one and would be appropriate for younger kids. And this is about Elodie, who wants to become an actress, but the traveling troupe acting group turns her away. And the only person or creature that will take her in because she's on her own and needs to work is a dragon. And this dragon solves mysteries. So he's like a detective dragon. And so she is living and being an apprentice to this dragon and is solving a mystery in this book. And it was a lot of fun and more appropriate for a younger audience. And I love a lot of her other books, but these are just two of my favorites that I wanted to talk about. And then finally, one of my absolute favorite authors is Shannon Hale. And I have loved everything I've read by Shannon Hale, and I love she does write some adult books, she does write some YA, she even has some graphic novels and things like that, but I would say these two are my favorite of her books. First of all, we have The Princess Academy, which is a trilogy, and I like the whole trilogy, but I love the first book, and then I think the next two books kind of go downhill, and not like bad, but aren't as good as this one. Like, this one's a 5-star book for me. I love it. It's about a young girl who lives in this mountain village, and we learn a lot about the people who live in this mountain village that are kind of on their own. They don't interact with the rest of their kingdom, but then the prince comes of age to find a princess, and in this kingdom, the way a prince finds a princess is that like the elders or magic people, I don't know who it is, pick which community the future princess is going to come from, and then all of the eligible girls are sent to an academy, princess academy, to learn how to be a princess, and then the prince picks one of them. And it happens to be that this year the mountain village is picked, and all of these girls, you know, they're not used to kind of being around rich people and nobles and all that stuff, and so they really have to learn a lot at the Princess Academy. And we follow one young girl, Miri, I believe her name is, and her experience at the Princess Academy, and I just think this is the sweetest story. I love it so much. And then one of my other favorites is Book of 1,000 Days. This is a standalone, so if you don't want to get into a series, I would highly recommend picking this one up. And this, we follow our main character, Dashti, who is a servant for a noblewoman, and the noblewoman gets in trouble from her dad because she refuses to marry her intended that her dad picks because he's a cruel man. And because she makes that decision, she gets punished and thrown into a tower, and her maid gets thrown in with her. So Dashti is forced to live in this tower with the noblewoman, and she is writing this all in her journal, so that the book is written in journal entries like day 73 and all that stuff, and it follows her time in the tower, how they survive, all that, and then all the adventures that they get up to. And I just love Dashti as a character. She's very strong and fun, and I just really enjoy her magic too. She has kind of, I wouldn't necessarily even call it fully magic. It's just like a way of singing that can kind of heal or talk to people's souls, things like that. And it is such a fun book. I love it. And that is it. This is probably going to turn out to be a long video because I have so many middle grade fantasy books that I love and adore. I'm reading more this month as part of Middle Grade March, so if you watch my recent reads coming up, you'll probably get more recommendations because I'm mostly reading middle grade fantasy. And if you have any recommendations of your favorite middle grade fantasy books, please put them down below because I'm always looking for more of them because I want to read them myself and love them, but then also keep them for my kids when they get old enough to read these and get to see all these amazing worlds. And if you think that you would like to see my middle grade contemporary recommendations, let me know, and maybe I'll make a shorter video about that because I have less of them that I enjoy than the fantasy. And that's all from me today. I'll see you next time. Bye.